Okay, hello again. Welcome back, and this should be, if you're watching these in order, the 7th DVD or podcast, or in whatever form you're watching it. And what we're going to talk about today is doing, as I have up here, we'll call them scales, although I have many other names that they are called as well. These will be, one of the names I have here is rapid assessment inventories, tests, psychological inventories. I also have surveys, but that may be a horse of a slightly different color. But these are the tools which are standardized, which we give to clients, and I have some examples listed down here. Things like a Beck depression inventory, things like estate trade anxiety inventory, things like the Enright forgiveness scale. They're standardized tools that somebody creates, and they do a whole bunch of testing on, and we're going to talk about how it goes from A to B. That's this thing with norms and reliability, validity, sampling, and so forth. Somebody creates an inventory to measure a particular state or psychological condition that a client may come in with as a concern. So there are tests for, and there's pretty much one out there for about anything that you and your clients might be working on. So you can measure mood states, you can measure stress, you can measure anxiety, you can measure depression, you can measure general mood across the board with many different types of mood states. You can measure contentment and happiness, suicidal risk, reasons for living, hopelessness, IQ, scholastic aptitude. There are so many inventories out there. And what we'll talk about is, why do we use these? What are some of the benefits and what are some of the drawbacks of using them? And that a better inventory is developed, and how does a better inventory compare to a less good inventory? How do you as a social worker make the decision of when do I use one of these sort of standardized, already developed inventories as compared to create my own? So what we've talked about in class thus far, with self-monitoring, with goal attainment scaling, with doing some sort of baseline, is you and the client are deciding to measure something, and you come up with a unique tool that fits this client in this situation in his or her life at this moment in time to learn a lot about this behavior. But they tend to be very idiosyncratic across people. So self-monitoring, and one of the things I talked about is the beauty of self-monitoring, is even if 5 people are monitoring their eating or their smoking, they could each be doing it quite differently. Well, this is sort of the polar opposite of the very individualized. This is everybody gets the same tool. So that if I decide to measure depression using the Hamilton Depression Scale, or the Burns Depression Inventory, or the Beck Depression Inventory, once I decide on a tool, then I decide that's what I'm going to use for all my clients, or everybody in this study, or everybody in this program evaluation or something, or just each individual client I see, I could choose to give the same depression test to. What is the benefit of using that as compared to doing something more individually tailored for each person? And so that is sort of what we'll be talking about, the whys of it, the benefits of it, are there drawbacks of it, and what might those be? So first of all, just sort of names. People will call these scales. People will call them tests. You know, I took a self-esteem test. I took a depression test. Now, a self-esteem test or a depression test is different from taking a multiple choice test at the end of advanced clinical evaluation, or taking a licensing test for your social work license, in that on a depression test there aren't right or wrong answers, whereas on the licensing test, on the comprehensive exam, there are right and wrong answers, and you either pass or you fail. So sometimes people get nervous about the word test. They just think it's sort of related to goodness and badness, whereas these are just inventories. They're to give a picture of your drinking, of your parenting skills, of your self-esteem. So they're called tests. They're called psychological inventories. If you buy the Fisher and Corcoran books, which are on the supplemental readings for this class, they call them RAIs, or Rapid Assessment Inventories. You might call them surveys, but surveys are often somewhat different in that a survey is many times given to look at people's attitudes, measure people's behavior, their thoughts on, should we build a new Walmart on the corner here? Who are you going to vote for? Or what are your thoughts on having sex offenders having a treatment facility for sex offenders built in this neighborhood or something like that? What we're going to talk about in here today are more things to measure an internal state that someone is experiencing. So if you look at, if any of you have taken the Myers-Briggs type inventory, the MBTI, it measures, are you introverted or extroverted? Where do you fall on that scale of introversion versus extroversion? Where do you fall on the scale of whether you're more sort of thinking or whether you're more sort of feeling? So that it's to say something about your personality or your state of sort of where I am in terms of my stress or my depression or whatever. So, and these are very commonly used. It's likely that many of you taking this class already use these in your agency, have probably taken some on your own, or if you don't use them in your agency, you know of somebody who does. So, why do we use these? What are the benefits? As I have up here, one is you can use them as we've talked about using some of the other tools in here. You can compare people across time. So if a client comes in today and this is the beginning of their work with you and they complain that they are just absolutely stressed out to the max and that their self-esteem doesn't exist, it's just diminished down to nothing. You could give them a state trait anxiety inventory. You could give them a Rosenberg self-esteem scale. You then have their scores on those tests. You could use those scores at the sort of beginning of treatment and compare them to how the client is doing again at the end of a month or at the end of 10 sessions or at the end of a year's worth of work or something like that. So you could use it as a pre-post measure. Similar to how you might use self-monitoring, how you might use a goal attainment scale, how you might use the A-B design that we've talked about. Another thing you can do with sort of the psychological inventories is you can compare people to others. So that if I do a goal attainment scale, that sort of says how it is you're meeting your goals. If I do a self-monitoring, that says how it is that you're sort of monitoring whatever you're looking at. If I do an A-B, you might rate your depression on a score of 0 to 10. But each of those are usually individually tailored, and comparing one person to another person may or may not fit very well. These tools, one of the strengths of them is that since everybody takes the same test, we assume that scores are comparable and kind of mean the same thing. So that if I take a Beck depression test and I score a 53, and someone else takes a Beck depression test and scores a 10, then my depression is wallopingly more severe than is the person who gets a 10 on the BDI. So you can compare across people. And this has to do with the test being standardized and also has to do some with norms. How do I make sense of that score of 54 and that score of 10? And we'll get there in a minute. So you can use it to compare the person to the person. One thing you can do. You can use it to compare different people. If I give everybody in a room a Beck depression inventory, I can score all of them, and then I can add them up, and I can compare. This person got a score of a 0. This person reports no depression. This is the least depressed person in the room. And we can organize everybody up to me who got the 54, who should probably be in a psychiatric hospital because I'm so incredibly depressed I might be at risk. I might be a risk to myself. And we can organize all the rest of us nice and numerically according, and we can do statistics, and that's a nice benefit or drawback depending on how you look at doing statistics. So we can compare people across time. We can compare them to others. We can compare them to a norm, and we'll get to that briefly. And as I just said, we can compile them easily. How in the world do you take 20 people's idiosyncratic self-monitoring scales and put them together? Now, you could give everybody the same pain diary. You could give everybody the same, when I led quit smoking clinics, we gave everybody the same smoking self-monitoring to carry around. And we could have compared people on those. It wouldn't have been the easiest thing to do, but we could have done it because they all had the same tool. Those were standardized. When I used to do pain management work, I had a copy of a pain diary in my drawer with about 2 columns that people could individually tailor, but with about the first 5 columns that were the same person to person. So you could compare those, but they don't stack up real easily. You have a Beck depression inventory, you score it. You have a state trait anger inventory, you score it. You have a Wechsler IQ test, you score it. Any of these yield one or several scores, and you can compare across people. You can compile it easily, you can compare across people, you can compare to norms. So there's some real benefits of sort of these standardized tools. The other thing is, if you're going to court and you need to impress a judge, or you need to try to look good to the attorney on your side and whoever is the attorney on the other side, a standardized instrument gives you more clout in court. So if you're working in a custody battle, it is far better to give mom and or dad some sort of standardized tool that you can say, this person has demonstrated parenting skills, we gave them the standardized test, we have the norms, and they look like a good parent. Or look, mom's good parent score is a 22 and dad's good parent score is a 75. The highest you can do is 100. Dad is way better than mom on this standardized test. It gives you more clout than, well, dad just strikes me as a nicer guy. So there's some benefits to some of this. So if I'm tossing around the term standardized, I'm tossing around the term norms. What do I mean? If we talk about a standardized test, and as I have down here, some of you may have taken some of these very tests. So I've got the Beck depression, the state trait anxiety inventory, the MMPI second version. This is the WISC. It's the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for kids. Those of you who work with children likely have read WISC scores if you work in schools. Many kids who see social workers in schools have WISC scores published in the kids' files. The SAT test. Probably most of you in class have taken either the SAT or the ACT or both in order to get into college. The GRE, which we do not require for this graduate program, but many graduate schools require the GRE. The WASL. Any of you who live in Washington State, and particularly those of you who live in Washington State and have children, have heard of the WASL. The MCAT is another standardized test for going into, I believe, medical school. Anyway, so these are all different tests which are standardized. So what do we mean when we say standardized? Part of it has to do with the fact that the instrument itself is standardized. It is the same tool. And for a good standardized test, it wasn't like one person sat down one day and decided to toss a bunch of questions into on their computer and give it out to zillions of people. Usually these tests are created by one or several thoughtful, intelligent people who know something about the topic. And then they test the test, and they revise it, and they test it, and they revise it. And it goes through multiple iterations before you see the SAT or the GRE or the WASL or the MMPI-2 or the Wechsler test that is in front of you. So it's often a multi-stage process, and we'll talk a little bit about some of that when we talk about reliability and validity revisited. So the instrument standardized, it's taken a while to get here. These are good items, these are good response choices, and everybody who gets the test gets the same thing. Now, in the most standardized form of test, everybody gets exactly the same thing. So back in the dark ages when I took SATs and GREs, we took them on paper instead of on computers. We sat down and everybody had a booklet. We all had 2 number 2 pencils. And that booklet was exactly the same question. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Everybody got the same booklet. If you take a Beck depression inventory, if you purchase it from the publishing company, everybody gets the same layout. Question 1 is always in the same place on the page. The font is the same and so forth. Sometimes people mess with the standards just a little bit. I've had students who, when they're taking an exam, their vision isn't as clear as it could be. So if I give the standard exam in 12 or 11 point font, but I have a student who doesn't read 12 or 11 point font very well, they may say, can you bump the font size up? And I'll bump theirs up to a 16 or 20 point font. They get fewer questions per page, and the font is bigger. It's not quite exactly as standardized. If one person has 5 questions on a page and another person has 3 questions on a page, have we lost anything in changing it? Well, some people would argue we have, and other people would argue we haven't. And it's an argument, it's a discussion worth having, and we will come back there after we talk about standardized administration. So the instrument is, the more exactly the same the tool is, the same questions, the same order, the same layout, the same font, the same everything, the more precisely standardized it is. Administration has to do with everybody who takes it gets pretty much the same setting and surroundings in which they're taking it. So the more standardized the administration. Again, back in the dark ages when I took the paper and pencil SAT and GRE, everybody in America who took them went on certain days of the year to specific locations. They were usually large universities, and you sat in an auditorium. We were told to bring 2 number 2 pencils with an eraser on the end. And there was that sealed booklet, and a proctor said at 8 o'clock, and everybody in the East Coast time zone at 8 o'clock, some proctor was reading a standardized set of instructions, nothing idiosyncratic about it. Every person read the exact same instructions. Take the eraser part of your number 2 pencil and slide it through the seal on your booklet. We'd open it, they'd read us the directions, now you may begin. And you could watch, probably if you had video cameras on all universities up and down the East Coast. Everybody's doing the same thing at the same time. Switch to the next time zone, there you are down the central part of the country. Everybody at their 8 o'clock is starting at the same place. We're all sitting in large lecture halls of major universities doing this test. That's a highly standardized administration. If I'm giving the MMPI to clients, when I was first working in mental health, we gave an abbreviated version of the MMPI, which breaks a little bit of the instrument standardization. It was called the Fasching-Bauer, and I think it was 189 questions or 289 questions. Anyway, it was a much briefer version than the 567 item one. So first of all, the tool is not exactly the same. Well, we had a lot of people at that time in the early 1980s, many people who, when they first came to a psych hospital, were put on a medication that made their vision blurry. And so I would have patients who would say, Heather, I can't see. Would you please read it out loud to me? Well, if you take an MMPI and you're reading it to yourself, and somebody else takes an MMPI and somebody's reading it out loud to them, that's a very different administration. And in some of the questions, things like I like mechanics magazines, I'm not sure it makes a huge difference. On others, I have engaged in bizarre and unusual sexual practices. I can see how, if I'm taking it in the privacy of my own room and just handing it in, I might answer that question perhaps a little differently than if I'm a psych patient sitting in a room with a 21-year-old college student who reads this question to me. It might be sort of hard for somebody to answer that question in a face-to-face setting. In the original MMPI, that wasn't the 2, that was the 1. I think that question has been removed. But the original MMPI had a bunch of very intimate questions that people would think, well, truth might be here, but I'm answering this to another human being, and it might lead them to lie to look good. So the administration is different. If I have you do a test in my office, or I have you take it home, it may be that you take it in the office independently, you take it home, and your boyfriend or girlfriend or spouse comes and says, I think that answer should be something different. Or it's a group process. You say to your kids, hey, how do you see me? How do you think I should answer this? That is a non-standardized administration. So anytime that people have a different setting in which they answer it, sort of dilutes the standardization. Well, why in the world do we standardize things in the first place? The idea is it levels the playing field. If any of you have run track or have watched a track meet, and so you have, the track court, which is like this. And if you're running on the outside, you're running a lot farther than the person who gets the lane on the middle. So how do they stack it up? Well, they stack it up such that the people who run on the outside start in a different lane, or they start ahead of the people who get the lanes on the inside. This is to standardize it so that if you're running a 100-yard dash, you're running a 440, you're running a mile, where you start does not make it the same. So it's to bring everybody up, to level the playing field, to make it even. The idea of standardizing the instrument and standardizing the administration is to level the playing field. The person who gets to take a test sitting at home with soft candles in their bathtub with soft music taking a test may respond differently from the person sitting in the office at the mental health center filling out the test all alone in a room. The administration might matter. If I ask you the questions out loud, it might make a difference from if you do it yourself. If I give it in 16-point font to somebody, you could say, well, they have a different number of questions on a page, and maybe you do better if there's more questions on a page or fewer. But if I don't change the font, the person who doesn't see well can't read the questions in the first place. Well, if you can't read the questions, then shouldn't I bump the font up? It messes with the standardization. If the person can't read because their vision is so blurry and I read it out loud, it's different from reading to yourself. But if you can't see, you can't do the item, so don't you need it administered orally? So there are benefits of standardizing. Everybody gets the exact same thing. There are drawbacks of standardizing. When we talk about cultural bias in testing, some of it has to do with this idea of standardization. If we bring people in to a large university lecture hall to take a test, that's a kind of traditional setting for middle class, for fairly privileged, well-educated, mainstream Americans. But if you bring kids who have grown up, let's say, in a Native American reservation, kids who may have grown up in the inner city, kids who may have been homeschooled, then this setting to them may be hugely uncomfortable and artificial, and they've never been in such a setting before. My son has a friend who took the SAT at a very young age just because some kids do. And she had been homeschooled and had gone to a sort of homeschool co-op type of private school for her entire life. And so when I asked her what was it like to take this SAT test, the very first thing that she said, and this is a like 6th grade kid taking a college entry test, she said, it was the strangest thing, Heather. She says, I went into a room, and in that room there were all these desks, and they were all in rows facing the same direction. It was amazing to me that the most remarkable thing that this very bright 6th grade kid noticed about taking an SAT test had nothing to do with the test and everything to do with what a classroom in a public school looks like. Well, I grew up in public schools. I teach in a college. If the camera was on the back of this room, there are chairs and desks lined up in rows. It's very common to me. To this young lady, it was very unusual. So when we try to level the playing field, when people have different cultural experiences, sometimes we actually unlevel the playing field. If we put it in 12-point font for everybody, the person who doesn't see small print very well, it's not equal for. But the idea is level the playing field, give everybody the same administration, give everybody the same test. Norms. What are norms? Well, first of all, when you go through the process of developing a really good test, you do a lot of testing of your test. You take the test, you say, I think this test measures self-esteem. I think this test measures depression. I think this test measures how good a parent is. But you really don't know. You think it measures that because you tried to craft good questions and maybe you tested them on your friends and so forth. But you really aren't sure that this is exactly what it does. So you do your reliability validity studies, and we'll get there in a minute. And then let's say that you decide your test is reliable and your test does have some validity. Once you've done all of that groundwork, you then say, now I need to get some norms. So the norms are, you go out and you choose a population that you want to use this test for. And here's another place where cultural issues come in. A test is good and can be used, and sort of we can make assumptions about a test to a population which is relevant to the population on whom the test was normed. If I norm a test on a group of kindergarten boys. And then I give it to a kindergarten boy. I'm comparing this client, kindergarten boy, to his peer group, other kindergartners. But if I norm a test on kindergarten boys, and I'm testing a 10th grade girl or 10th grade boy, well, if he looks like his reading is excellent, well, you would expect a 10th grader to read better than a kindergartner. If it looks like he's got wonderful impulse control, well, you'd expect a 10th grader to have much better impulse control than a kindergartner. So when you look at a test and you look at your client, you have to say, who is the test normed on? Who is the sample that they gave it out? And these are the people on whom we base how to interpret the data, what to make of these scores. So if the test was tested on a bunch of white, privileged, college-age kids, and you work here in Walla Walla at the farm labor kid with many people who their parents have just moved up here from Mexico. They speak very little English, and their culture is enormously different from the white privileged college sort of naturalized Americans or people who've been here for multiple generations. Can you really compare those? Can you use your college sample to interpret the data on people who are growing up in the farm labor camp or living in the farm labor camp? Can you use that data for people who have experiences very differently? So your norming sample is on whom do you test the test. Once you have sort of given out your test, and you try to have this be representative of the groups that you want to make statements about. So if it's going to be a clinical test, you hope your norming sample is made up of sort of a good clinical group of people drawn. You then figure out, okay, we have these scores. How do I make sense of the scores? So if we use a test that many of you are probably roughly familiar with, so let's say we use an IQ test, and this is the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, known as the WISC. There's also the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, known as the WAIS. On both of them, we have by definition said that the average IQ score is a 100. How in the world do we know that? We got it from our norming sample. We took this test, we administered it to a huge cross-section, thousands of Americans drawn from different economic classes, different marital status, different ages, and so forth. And we found, and we created the test so that the average person gets a score of 100. If I test a kid who gets a score of 150, what does that mean? If I test a kid who gets a score of a 47, what does that mean? If I test a graduate student who gets a score of 123, how do I interpret that? That's what norms do. Norms give us a way of saying this score means this. So that we know that if you have an IQ of 100, it means A, you're smack dab average, whatever that means in terms of IQ. And then we say, well, what does smack dab average IQ mean? Well, it means that with some effort and some motivation, you can probably do pretty well in grade school, middle school, high school, and if you're willing to work, you can probably do well in college and do pretty well in life. If your IQ score is 123, it means that a number of things will probably come more easily to you than the person who scores 100. And if your score is a 47, it means you're really going to struggle through much of life because your brain just doesn't quite grasp things real quickly or retain things real well or think conceptually very well. And then IQ tests have 10 to 12 different subtests, and you can see sort of what people are better at and what people are worse at. But rough IQ scores, that would be how you interpret them. If we go back to the Beck depression inventory, if I have a BDI score of 54, how in the world do I know what that means? That's where we go to the norms. In our norming sample with this large number of people, we found that people with a score of 54, they were really, really hurting. Serious depression, terribly low energy, bad sleep, trouble with their appetite, mood was just dreadful. I mean, a score of a 54 in a BDI is hard to get unless you just feel awful. You get a score of a 7. Yeah, you're doing reasonably well. Occasionally, this gets you down, that gets you down, but generally speaking, you're doing quite well in terms of depression. But we know that from doing the work, norms and norm examples. Part of also what you do when you develop a test, we talked about reliability. Reliability is the ability for a test to measure something consistently. If IQ really is a consistent thing, I should be able to take an IQ test today and take an IQ test a month later, and the score should be fairly comparable. If depression is something, if mood sort of varies by minute or by hour or by day, but depression as in clinical depression should be fairly stable from at least week to week. If I take a BDI today, I should have a similar BDI score next week. And if I don't, maybe there's trouble with the test. If I take the SAT and the possible top score is a 1600, and today I get a score of a 1200, and I take it again and I get a score of a 1600, and that's like with a week in between. Unless I studied really, really hard, that's a very unstable score. If you guys take a multiple choice test for this class, and if you take it on Monday and you get the average score is a 92 for the class, and on Tuesday the average score for the class is a 65, I'm going to say it was the same test. What happened? I would expect if you knew it on Monday, you should remember it on Tuesday. If the scores are that variable, we say maybe it really isn't that people are changing. Maybe it's that the test is unreliable. An unreliable test is one that measures inconsistently. And so if you have a bunch of items which are vague, a bunch of items where the wording is terribly unclear, a bunch of items where, it's toss a coin, maybe it's yes and maybe it's no, you guess differently every time. So a good psychological inventory has things which are reasonably clear. So let's say you're asking a question about drinking behavior, and you say, how much alcohol do you drink? Or how often do you drink alcohol? And your options are never, rarely, sometimes, often, and always. How often do you drink alcohol? And somebody's taking this test and they say, I really don't think I drink very much at all. They fill that question out. They go out, they talk to some people. People they're talking to are very, very, very much non-drinkers. And so they mention that, they have a beer or a glass of wine 2, 3, 4 times a week. And the people in the script say, oh my goodness, you drink a lot. And then they read an article that says if you have, 1 glass of wine or beer a day, as, some health experts are saying might be, if you want to drink alcohol, maybe 1 glass of beer or wine a day isn't a bad thing. And that turns you, that's a moderate drink. And I say, oh, well, maybe I don't drink rarely. Maybe I actually sort of drink pretty often. Well, they've changed their score, but they haven't changed their behavior. So is it rarely? Is it sometimes? Is it often? One person's I rarely drink is another person's I often drink. So the more vague your questions are sometimes, the less reliable your test will be, simply because it's vague, and so I interpret it one way today and I interpret it another way tomorrow. If we go to validity, again, validity is, does the test measure what it's supposed to measure? So if I take a Beck test, it should measure how depressed I am. If I take the GRE test, it's supposed to measure how potentially good a graduate student I'll be. If the GRE test measures graduate student goodness and the SAT measures college student goodness, it should be that people who score higher on the SAT have a more successful college career than people who score poorly. If the GRE is a valid measure of graduate performance, people who score high on the GRE should do better in graduate school, get better grades, go through more easily, and graduate at a higher rate than do people who are admitted to graduate school, because they have to be admitted in order to know how they do. And if they get low scores, those would be the people who would drop out, who would flunk a lot of classes, who would struggle terribly, who would be terribly stressed all the time. So if the tests are valid, then they actually sort of measure what it is you hope they're measuring. If you know that a test is standardized, everybody gets the same test, it's all the same tool, there are norms. You can say, this person's alcohol score puts them into the problem drinker category. This person's alcohol score puts them into the very light drinker category. This person abstains and this person looks very alcoholic because of the way that they answered the questions. And you know, because other people with scores like that, this is what you know about their behavior, because it's a well-tested test. It's consistent. It measures what you think it's measuring. It's standardized. It has norms that you can interpret. You can then go back. You can compare people across time. You can compare them to other people. You can compare them to a norm. You can say, your score on the SASE, your score on the MAST, your score on this drinking test says that your drinking is likely to be problematic at a pretty high level, pretty likely highly problematic. Or you drink more than 97% of everybody who's taken this test. That can be a wake-up call to someone. You give someone an eating disorders test, and they find out that their score is in the 99th percentile of troubled eating. That can be a wake-up call to a young man or woman to say, wow, I tried lying to myself that this wasn't the problem, but this test makes it look kind of like maybe it is. So sometimes norms are very helpful for people to recognize themselves. You can compile them with one another, and you can compare sort of one person to the next. You can line up your, most depressed to least depressed, most stressed to least stressed. Other benefits of these is they're fairly easy. Your agency owns them. You give them to clients. They fill them out. They give them to you. The secretary scores them, and you get a score, and you can just at the beginning of a session see how it is that people are doing. So this is kind of what these tools are, what the benefits are. The drawback, of course, is that one size fits all doesn't necessarily really fit anybody as closely, and we've talked about that before. Think about the outfit that you buy, one size fits all. It is the same depression inventory, the same stress test that everyone takes, and it may not really get at the richness, it may not get at the idiosyncrasies for any one person the way that you might get at with doing a qualitative interview with your client, with doing a self-monitoring scale with your client. But it does have all the benefits that come with standardization, and it is easier to compile one person to the next to the next. You can toss it in a computer. You can do your means, your medians, your modes. You can compare men and women. You can compare treatment groups pre and post. So it lends itself to a lot more statistical richness. And as we move now from talking single subject to talking about developing programs, doing program evaluations, into looking at more people, it's easier to use things that are more standardized with larger groups than it is to use things which are more idiosyncratic. It's just way easier to compare across individuals. And that is all I have to say about creating psychological tests or scales on this, which is DVD number 7 in the series.